disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. Is there any hope for Amtrak and American passenger rail? Well, it could emerge from the despondency of endless highway congestion. Train ridership levels are high. Operating losses are declining. Maybe, just maybe, we are at a fork in the rails. Stay with us. Full Disclosure airs on NPR member station VPM News and on iTunes at link fulldradio.com. Join us on Facebook and Twitter at Full D Radio. Joining me from Manhattan, Bloomberg Businessweek correspondent Devin Leonard. I used to sit next to good Devin. He has a feature. He has a feature in the magazine which I really wanted to pounce on called "How to Save Amtrak or Ruin It." The head of America's passenger rail system isn't particularly attached to trains. Maybe that's a good thing. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, Robin? Thanks for having me.
I love it. This is a blast. Could you begin with some background for our listeners? The very inception of Amtrak. It's almost 50 years old, and my impression was always that the passenger rail services, which were splintered all across the country, were effectively nationalized and broken out of the freight train business in the early 70s because they were all so insolvent. And so Richard Nixon, I think, in creating Amtrak in the early 70s, it was never intended to be more than a stopgap. Is that right?
Well, yeah, pretty much. I mean, back 50 years ago, there were no sort of passenger railroads and freight railroads. The railroads, there were big railroad companies and they ran everything. But with the rise of the, national highway system and then the, federally subsidized aviation industry, the passenger rail business started just to go south, and literally many of these biggest companies were in danger of going into bankruptcy. So they convinced Congress and the Nixon administration to back legislation to basically bail them out, to take the passenger railroads off their hands, and as you said, nationalize it. And the thing is that a lot of people, the people in the Nixon administration, they thought, give us 5 years, we'll just run all these old passenger trains into the ground, I guess, and then this business will just go away. We wouldn't have to worry about Amtrak. I mean, it's not going to last very long.
And here we are nearly 5 decades later, and it is effectively, do or die. We have to live with it. I want to quote from a chunky passage in your feature, if I may. Quote, "If you wanted to create a railroad from scratch, you'd never design one like Amtrak. It had 32 million riders last year and revenue of $3.2 billion. But it had an adjusted operating loss of $171 million and has needed federal subsidies to stay afloat every year since Congress created it in 1971. The most functional piece of Amtrak is the 457-mile Northeast corridor between Boston and Washington. The trains on this line may not be as fleet as the bullets of Europe and Japan, but they run frequently and can pretty much be on time. Amtrak can make sure that because it owns almost all the Northeast Corridor track and controls much of the dispatching on it, which helps explain why the corridor had 12 million riders last year and an operating profit of $524 million. Then there's the rest of Amtrak's 22,000-mile network. Do you want to catch Amtrak in Cleveland? There's no train leaving there before 1:54 a.m. or after 5:50 a.m. Bring something to read, because outside the Northeast Corridor, Amtrak's long-distance trains operated according to schedule only 43% of the time last year. That just blows my mind. How can this stand 50 years in, mediocre or not? You'd think that the government would have whipped it into shape. I know it's government-owned, it's quasi-private. How is this continuing today?
Well, Robin, that's the whole. That's what a lot of the stories about, and really where a lot of the problem lies is that, yeah, it's a government-owned, passenger rail system, except for the most part, it operates on private tracks. The tracks are owned by the freight companies, and by law, they're supposed to give Amtrak trains preference. In practice, they often don't. So there's this sort of dysfunction that's just built into to Amtrak, and the freight companies have fought the Federal Railroad Administration and Amtrak's efforts to come up with some sort of on-time performance standards that would make, well, basically ultimately force the freight railroads to make good on that preference promise and to make the Amtrak trains run on time. But it's a long saga.
Devin, I'm thinking back to AP history 25 years ago, and it almost smacks of the era of the robber barons. I mean, you have the progeny of Commodore, whatever, all of these guys, Vanderbilt in the 19th century. So I'm looking at your story, and it says Amtrak network track ownership. Amtrak owned or leased track is only 3% of total.
Right.
Then there's BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, other railroads. These have been massively profitable. Warren Buffett owns one of them. CSX is a roll up of so many other companies on the East Coast. How is it that the government just isn't? Is it up to the Department of Transportation to enforce that you guys have to share, or it's just kind of left to benign neglect?
When Amtrak trains were given preference, that was about 2 years after the creation of Amtrak in 71. The only entity or whatever part of government that could actually enforce preference or go after the freight railroads was the Department of Justice. They've only done that once. So over the years, this problem continues, and in I think it was in 2008 around then, there was new legislation passed, and Congress told Amtrak and the FRA to come up with its on-time performance standards. Well, the American Association of Railroads, which is the chief sort of lobbying group for all the freight railroads, Amtrak, paradoxically, as I say in the story, is also a member. They sued in I think it was 2011, and that case went up to the Supreme Court twice. Finally, the Supreme Court just, I guess said a lower court ruling would stand in the FRA and Amtrak's favor. That was in June. So now Amtrak and the FRA are working on coming up with those standards. We'll see what happens. But I guess to sum it up, it was maybe sort of screwed up legislation, and then the intransigence of the freight industry that's delayed this for so long.
So Richard Anderson, right, who was the CEO of Delta, he really has no reason to have to come and do this. Delta, Delta has been a profitable thing for him. He moved on. He had a package. This has been kind of a job that nobody has liked. It's almost like the MTA and everything.
Totally.
But he's here enjoying it and trying to bring discipline of safety and operational improvements and some modicum of accounting to something that's really hard to get your number head around. But I look at it. He did an interview also with Here and Now, the show on NPR with Jeremy Hobson. And they posted, Amtrak says its operating loss now is at $29 million, which is an 82% improvement over last year. And that's reduced $400 million over 5 years. So that is definitely a trajectory. But don't say that the company is approaching a true break even, because it has a backlog of infrastructure investment approaching $40 billion. Meanwhile, Congress is giving it, $2 billion a year?
Right.
So you can never really look at this as a kind of an apples to apples. If you were to break it out, it would be profitable on its own. It kind of lives on the patience and generosity of others. Like, put it another way, this company could never have self-determination, whether it's the congressmen and women who want stops in their districts to extend the budgeting of Amtrak, or the host freight railroads. It really needs the help of so many other people just to even approach non-GAAP break even.
Well, and I think what Anderson's trying to do, or the way he would articulate it, is that if we can go in there and sort of show that we can actually run Amtrak more like a business, run it more efficiently, show we're not being, wasting money, that we'll be in a better chance of getting, those really big amounts that we need. The $41 billion, I've actually seen that number closer to 42 now, 41 billion, 42 billion, who's counting? But maybe they'll get enough of that money to actually, do something on that's all just for the Northeast Corridor. But so they expect to be, operationally break even next year, and they seem pretty close to it now. So, but that's what he's trying to do.
Devin, one of the formative experiences of my life is October 24th to 31, 1986. The late fifth grade social studies teacher, Mr. Pakula, took us on a trip from Miami to New York over train. I don't even remember what it's called, Silver Palm.
The Silver Meteor.
Silver Meteor.
Meteor, excuse me.
It could not have been profitable, but what was amazing, I had never seen fall colors. I remember at night we finally passed D.C. and we saw the Capitol Rotunda. And in the morning, there were these blueberry pancakes, and we got to go upstairs in this glassed-in dome and look at the thing. That's not a profitable or efficient line, is it?
Well, none of the long distance. There's 15 long distance routes, and none of them are profitable.
So Richard Anderson, you wrote in your story, it says the heresies have continued. He's there, in April 2018, Amtrak said it was eliminating traditional dining car service on overnight trains on 2 routes east of the Mississippi. For decades, part of the ritual for sleeping car passengers was strolling to the dining car for surf and turf, prepared to order by a chef. Now they're getting something closer to airline treatment, ready to serve meals heated for them on the train. No more Agatha Christie, if you will. There was always, I don't know if it's true that the Northeast Corridor line, for all of its flaws and peculiarities, is subsidizing all of these scenic routes, on the order of like 3-to-1 or 4-to-1.
Well, I'm not sure it's quite that simple, but I mean the fact of the matter is those long distance lines lose so much money that whatever operating profit the Northeast Corridor makes, that's pretty much eaten up by the losses those other railroads. I mean, leaving aside the meals for a second, what Anderson, his bigger plan though for those routes and to try to turn them into the routes that make money, and I think he would say more importantly serve people better, but is to sort of cut them up into shorter routes, run maybe that would be also be more state supported and have more money, and they'd be able to run trains more often. But his whole thing is he wants to create these sort of corridors between cities over distances that are too problematic to drive because of traffic congestion, and then it's too much of a hassle to fly because it takes too long with post 9/11 security requirements and all that stuff. And that's a really interesting idea. Of course, he's getting a lot of pushback from senators in rural states who are worried that.
Let me point out that example. You wrote, for train lovers, the moment of truth was when Anderson, the CEO, initially refused to put up funds to improve a 400-mile stretch of the Southwest Chief between Dodge City, Kansas, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Anderson said it would be more prudent to run a bus between the two cities instead. And then, quote, the idea that Amtrak would think about replacing passenger service with bus service for 400 miles and believe that we would still have a long-distance passenger train service is something I can't get over. Quote, Senator Jerry Moran, a Kansas Republican, scolded Anderson in a hearing in June. And doesn't that get to the problem is you need that $2 billion or so stopgap every year. You're desperate for it. I mean, you're not even covering your own costs, much less scraping the surface of infrastructure investments, and you need the entire House and the entire Senate to put its stamp on that.
Well, that's totally true, Robin. The only thing is that if you go deeper into the situation, with the Southwest Chief, and maybe a little deeper than I was able to go into in the story, but that's a part of the railroad that's owned by the Buffett Company. I'm going to mess up the acronym if I say that BNSF, but it's a section that they're no longer using. They don't want to spend money on it anymore. It needed, among other things, positive train control, which is a whole safety system. So basically, it was up to Amtrak to spend all the money, which is more than $100 million, and basically. So Anderson was sort of playing hardball, but basically saying, look, we don't have that much money. It'd be easier to just to run a bus in between. But he's also trying to say, what's the purpose of these long distance lines? A lot of them were created 100 years ago. They're really set up for the people going from one end to the other. In that case, from Chicago to to the West Coast. So you can leave in the afternoon at a decent time, get in the next day or 2 days later at a decent time. But a lot of the routes in between are kind of ill-served, and so maybe we should sort of chop these up. I mean, he was being provocative, but he was trying to I think he was trying to kind of start a conversation there. I don't know how well it worked, with Congress, but he's right. Really he's trying to say there's all these things we haven't discussed. We have to discuss them, and it's going to rub some people the wrong way, but that's kind of we have to start to do that.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. Joining us from Manhattan is Bloomberg Businessweek correspondent Devin Leonard on his feature on Amtrak and a fork in the rail, if you will.
Yeah.
I go back to a 2011 story that I recall in Bloomberg. It was the then CEO of CSX, one of the biggest railroads in the country. The then CEO says his railroad wants no part of high-speed or higher-speed rail passenger trains because he can't earn a profit from having them operate on CSX tracks. I'm a corporation, he says. I exist to make money, okay? You can't make money hauling passengers. So why would I want to do that? That wouldn't be fair to my shareholders. And it said it may not have been his intent, but the CEO's comments were reminiscent of 19th century robber baron and New York Central Railroad chairman William Henry Vanderbilt's infamous uttering, "The public be damned." History rhymes, I guess, doesn't it?
Well, and I mean, there's a funny sort of legal sort of gray area in this. I don't totally understand it, but basically, the freights kind of have to let Amtrak, on the rails. That's sort of part of the deal when when the government, bailed them out. I mean, the question but then there's sort of a big negotiation, typically between the freights and Amtrak about, well, if you want any kind of on-time performance, we need the government to kick in money to sort of build new sidings on train tracks and improve the infrastructure and all that stuff. So I mean, to just say he can say I don't want to do it, but that's not this. Legally, technically, he kind of has to. But then it gets into a sort of a big negotiation about how to what's it going to take to actually provide sort of decent service, and that's where the freights have a lot of leverage there.
Run me through the thought simulation, because I know Justin Fox, your colleague at Bloomberg Opinion,
he wrote a great story. Yeah,
he wrote a great story on maybe Amtrak isn't about to turn a profit. That whether you use generally accepted accounting principles or earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, one-time state subsidies, and blah, blah, blah,
right.
blah, blah, earnings before obfuscation.
Right.
I think it brought the interesting thought exercise to me is, he posted a chart that said where Amtrak makes money
right.
and where it doesn't. Adjusted operating earnings lost by service line. If I take the Northeast Corridor, the jewel in the crown, in fiscal 2019, that's about a $570 million operating profit. In state-supported lines, negative, $58 million loss. Long distance, $475 million loss. Infrastructure access, they lost $111 million on that. Ancillary services, a profit of $45 million. Total adjusted operating loss, $29.8 million, about $30 million. So he writes, from the looks of it, the Northeast Corridor is doing great, and the state-supported services such as the Pacific Surfliner in Southern California and the Hiawatha between Chicago and Milwaukee are doing okay, thanks in part to that $234 million in state support. The overnight long-distance trains, on the other hand, appear to be kind of a disaster. But this then gets into the ledger domain of, I don't even know how you cost allocate these things. You could not even in a thought exercise just strip away the Northeast Corridor, which is an enormous revenue center for Amtrak that's subsidizing the rest of the system, and say, here, we just break it out and privatize it.
Right.
It's not going to need subsidies. I mean, you're then assuming that the freight trains behave. You're assuming that the state subsidies kick in. You're assuming that it would not need the overall $2 billion subsidy. Walk me through that thought exercise when you have so many administrations and people in the Hill have said, we're just going to defund Amtrak and let's privatize it. Can you?
Can you just privatize Amtrak?
Let's say the Northeast Corridor.
I think maybe you could. The problem is that you'd have to do something about the $41 billion in.
These are enormous tasks, to say nothing of, you used to ride New Jersey Rail between,
right.
What Governor Christie did, and after Superstorm Sandy. Just to quote again, I'm kind of breathless about this. The 1910 swing span drawbridge over the Hackensack River near the Secaucus Station in New Jersey is said to be the busiest rail bridge in the Western Hemisphere, but workers sometimes have to smack it with a sledgehammer after it's been opened to get the rails back in place. The price tag in Amtrak's fiscal 2020 funding request for replacing it with a taller bridge that wouldn't need to be open for passing boats, $1.8 billion. The rail tunnels under Baltimore, south of Amtrak Station, were built in 1873.
Yeah, practically the Civil War. No, totally.
And have curves and a grade that necessitate slow-speed trains. Estimated cost of a straighter, flatter replacement, $5 billion. And then, one more, Devin.
No, I know the one you're going to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can speak to it.
We can talk about that, too. Yeah,
the two tunnels
right.
under the Hudson River that Amtrak and commuter trains use to travel between Jersey and New York City have been in use since 1910, were damaged by flooding from Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and may not be usable for much longer without major repairs. The latest estimate of the cost to fix them and dig a new tunnel to allow trains to keep rolling during the repairs and add capacity when they're done is $11.3 billion. What say you, sir?
Here's what I say. I wrote a story 2 years about Penn Station and those tunnels, and I talked to scientists who said that if there's another hurricane, Sandy-like event, those tunnels could wind up collapsing because if they flood and then the water goes out. The pressure from the water, and then the dissipation of the pressure could cause those tunnels to collapse. So I mean. Well, to get to your point about about privatizing Amtrak, and this just isn't like some regular, well, either business or governmental agency. I mean, that's an enormous liability, wouldn't you say? The possibility that those tunnels could collapse under the Hudson.
Yeah, so that's the problem is you want to break it out, but in a perfect world, Amtrak would be able to just post earnings, operating profit sans $40 billion or more of infrastructure investment, which Anderson himself has said that, we've spent decades and decades just starving infrastructure in this country. Meanwhile, I-95, I-285,
right,
you go,
right.
the I-10 in California, the 101, the 405, they're always under construction.
And nobody ever says, "Oh, we need to stop funding those, or we should, that isn't important, or we shouldn't, fund, airports and things like that." And it is unfair. And the whole idea that somehow rail, sort of by definition, is a boondoggle, which some people would say that's all. That's all really worked against Amtrak over the years and worked against sort of passenger rail in general.
So I'm really interested in, Richard Anderson wanting to double down. This is by far not a perfect scenario being handed to someone, and you got to give him props at his age and his experience for kind of wanting to roll up his sleeves and spar with congressmen and states and localities and both the combination of not in my backyard and if you're going to cross through, you better build it in my backyard. So he wants to double down on these urban routes where the highways are impossibly congested. And if you just kind of do an actuarial or population analysis, there's no more room to build out. Population's going to increase. It's going to get worse. We clearly have it in the Beltway. You clearly have it in SoCal. You clearly have it in Atlanta. So he's talking about routes like doubling down on Milwaukee, Chicago, San Diego, to L.A., the Northeast Corridor, clearly. And then I see surreal headlines like July 25th, 2019, Amtrak to launch nonstop Acela service between New York and D.C. Hello, nonstops. Now you're launching nonstop service? This idea that he's going to differentiate on the lines that he already has and maybe have price points be different. Isn't that a little surreal to you that we're only in 2019 launching nonstop service between New York and D.C.?
Well, I mean, I guess better late than never. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that for the most part, Amtrak hired, all these people from, who'd worked in sort of public transportation, authorities or whatever, and their mentality, was more political. I think, and there were certain. Lines that they just weren't going to cross. They weren't going to try to take on, people in Congress and the Senate, who felt that these long distance routes were sacrosanct, and they weren't going to take on the unions. They weren't going to take on sort of rail fans and people like that. And this guy comes in and he's just coming off this enormously successful, stint as CEO of Delta and basically sort of resurrecting the company after it came out of bankruptcy, merging it with Northwest. And he just looks at everything, looks at the world completely differently, and certainly looks at the situation completely differently. And it's just really interesting.
I going back to the Justin Fox column, which he gave you props in your feature for Businessweek.
Yeah.
If you have these people, these partisans, either Amtrak lovers or the others who call it Scamtrak, and we need to break it up and show it tough love and privatize it. Maybe, just maybe the answer is somewhere definitely in the middle. He goes, passenger trains bring with them positive externalities such as reduced road traffic and pollution and more livable pedestrian-oriented cities. Along the Northeast Corridor, they're crucial to the functioning of a regional economy that accounts for 25% of U.S. GDP.
Right.
More faster and in some cases entirely new train services along other densely populated corridors in California, Texas, Florida, and the Great Lakes, the Southeast, and elsewhere could be an economic and environmental boon. That will take a lot of investment. Some may come from private sources, and private train operators may be a better choice than Amtrak for many of the routes. But the evidence from around the world, The bullet train services on the Japanese main island of Honshu seem to be the lone major exception, is that continued public infrastructure investment is required to make passenger rail work. So again, we step back from this. It's kind of a damned if they don't, damned if they do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know quite what to say. I mean, you just put it, you just put it really well yourself. I mean, there are just these huge, economic benefits from having, an improved rail system. You're already seeing it, as you said, in the Northeast Corridor, and given the direction of the country, the increases in population, we're going to see the increased issues with the highways and the fact that you can't really widen them anymore. I mean, that's what Anderson says sort of at the end. My story. He says, yeah, there are obstacles, but sooner or later, these larger trends, demographic and population and otherwise, they're going to overwhelm the obstacles. We have no choice but to do this. The question is if that's going to happen. He's going to still be the CEO of Amtrak when that happens, or if he'll fail and maybe it'll be up to somebody else.
Devin, you and I have always pondered, private profit, socialized risk, and with the bailouts and everything else. This seems to be the peculiar case of, you do want publicly backed losses for enormous, Justin Fox calls them externalities. You can't measure the importance. It's dysfunctional if I try to leave Richmond at 7 a.m. and try to get to D.C. At some points of leaving D.C., it used to be that you want to leave before 3 o'clock to make it back south in time and avoid the mixing bowl and everything. And now it's closer to 2 o'clock. Yeah. We can't count on the highways anymore. And that's an enormous hit on productivity. I think, again, about the 101 and the 405. If you want to get from one part of L.A. to the other part of L.A. or Atlanta's infamous, the 285 route. When does Congress as a whole realize that one way or another somebody is absorbing these costs, either in lost productivity or the government throwing transportation dollars? I'm thinking about Justin Fox pointing to this stat. Amtrak's net loss, according to generally accepted accounting principles, was $875 million, up from $817 million in fiscal year 2018. Amtrak also reported receiving $234 million in support from the governments of states through which some of its trains run. Without that money, losses would have been well over $1 billion. So at some point, are we just throwing generally accepted accounting out the window and said we need to have societal accounting for this?
Well, sure. I mean, that's really, that's the argument right now. That that Anderson can do everything he can to try to make Amtrak run more efficiently, but ultimately they need money, a lot more money, even if they're operationally profitable. But the other question is, I'm also working on a story about Virgin Trains. I mean, the first
in Florida, in South Florida,
the first privately operated passenger train service. Some would say in more than a century. And then has everything gotten so bad that maybe private companies will get back into the passenger rail business? I mean, I think that's a really interesting question.
That's an interesting, sideline to it. Is everybody there thought that it was destined to fail, but it's actually quite popular in South Florida, where I'm from. Is the old Brightline service, and Virgin came in and acquired it?
No, they took a small equity position, and I think it's really a brand, kind of a branding thing. It's almost like, so, our president, putting his name on an office building or something like that. But I think the former Brightline folks feel they benefit from having that kind of name recognition. But I don't think Virgin's really all of that involved.
So we also have the neighbors that share tracks with Amtrak, and you are all too familiar with New Jersey Transit. It has its many summers of hell out of Penn Station.
I think every summer is a summer of hell in New Jersey Transit these days.
Metro North, which I took to get from Westchester to New York. Grand Central Station is marginally more pleasant and reliable, but all of these guys have unsatisfactory service. The Long Island Railroad has been a disaster also, many parts of it. They find cost overruns, ticket prices hiked, on-time schedule deteriorating year after year. To what extent are we kind of looking at this in the wrong way, Amtrak versus the regional train companies and the commuter trains? They all have to use the same infrastructure. They all have to deal with the same tunnels. They're all on the same track.
Well, and in the case of the Hudson tunnels, on the Northeast Corridor, I think New Jersey and New York are ready to put in a lot of money. They're sort of waiting for the federal government to do something. There was a deal, in the Obama administration for the federal government to put in a lot of money to fix up those tunnels, and then the Trump administration kind of backed out of it. So, no, none of these things are going to happen without some major state involvement. And I think that's the hope. Anderson's hope is that once you go below 750 miles, it's on an Amtrak line, the states, have to kick in money. So that's sort of, I think, that's part of the strategy is that for these shorter routes that, it'll be, they can get more money from the states, and that makes it all seem maybe more doable.
In closing, Devin Leonard, in my lifetime, and I'm still a young man in my 40s, am I ever going to see a kind of a Pudong, China-style high-speed rail on the eastern seaboard? Is there ever going to be the unanimity and the eminent domain and everything necessary to build a true bullet train to get me, say, from D.C. to New York in chump change time?
Well, if it happens, Robin, you're going to be more likely to see it than I will because I'm about 20 years older than you. So, Devin, I hope you do.
Devin Leonard, I can't thank you enough for joining us.
No, great to be here, Robin.
You have to read his feature in Businessweek on Amtrak. Give me the title.
Well, I guess online it says Amtrak CEO has a plan to fix Amtrak. You won't like it, and then the one in print is
how to save Amtrak or ruin it.
Ruin it. Yeah.
The head of America's passenger rail system isn't particularly attached to trains. Maybe that's a good thing. Sir, thank you so much, and I look forward to your upcoming pieces on the industry.
All right.
My guest in studio is Danny Plaugher, Executive Director of Virginians for High-Speed Rail, an association of citizens and communities in the Commonwealth advocating for better passenger rail. How are you, sir?
Good. How about yourself, Robin?
I'm great, thank you. I want to quote from a recent column you had in the local newspaper. Even though passenger rail received less than 4% of the $23 billion that Virginia has spent on our transportation system over the past decade, it's the fastest growing mode of transport during that time frame. Our 54% growth in ridership far outpaces the passenger growth at our airports, up 11%, or the increase in vehicle miles traveled on our roadways, up 4%, which proves that Virginians want an alternative to congested highways and ever-shrinking legroom. As evidenced by the infamous Staples Mill Station, which I thought, here in Richmond, which I thought was merely the busiest in Virginia, but you say...
It's the busiest in the entire Southeast.
Get out.
Yeah, almost 400,000 people take that station every single year. 18 trains serve it. It goes all the way up as far north as Boston and service all the way down to past Atlanta into Florida. So a lot of folks utilize that station.
No offense intended to anyone, but it's not a beautiful station.
It is not. I mean, it is a trailer on a parking lot.
Iron Curtain, East Germany feel to it.
It definitely has retro 1970s like infrastructure written all over it.
And so here's my question is why is it as a counterpoint to that two things down track is the former train station is now the Museum of Science. I always go there and I wonder why they had to annex that, why you can't feel the grandeur of coming in onto Broad Street in a Pennsylvania station type infrastructure that was moved decades ago into Main Street Station. It seems like a great place to throw weddings and bar mitzvahs, but not if you want to catch a train.
When everything became privatized, when the private railroads gave up the service and moved it over to what is now Amtrak, they no longer subsidize these large, glorious stations anymore, which is how the Science Museum ended up being where it is and why Main Street Station ended up being a mall and an office park and everything else until it became a rail station again in the mid-2000s, and how we ended up with these suburban stations that look like trailers on parking lots.
How much of this problem, I've heard things about Main Street Station because it's gorgeous. I wish everybody could come into Richmond in this kind of, is it 100 years old? It survived floods, fires, everything. We take it on Father's Day. We take the kids and the nephews and everything. They put on the conductor's hats. And we, like I said, we use the mediocrity to our advantage because it takes forever to get between there and Ashland. And we take over the dining car and go all aboard. But you'd wish that people could come into Richmond, Virginia in the splendor of Main Street Station. Are there track gauge issues and CSX issues?
There's not necessarily track gauge. There is really it's just a matter of building more capacity between Main Street Station and Staples Mill. Main Street Station is a complicated station. It's elevated. All the tracks are elevated into and out of it for the most part. And so when you're trying to expand capacity over viaducts, that is much more expensive and much more complicated than it is if the tracks were just laying on the ground. Because you have to figure out how do you get individuals and passengers with disabilities off if they're on the far away track furthest from the station and get them over to the platform. And so there's a lot of complicated issues that have to be dealt with. But I think, the plans, the DC to Richmond high-speed rail plan is done. The study is completed. That is planning to add a lot more service through Main Street Station. And so it's on the horizon.
$95 million transformation that the Main Street Station sites boast. And yes, it is gorgeous again, but I wonder opportunity costs. Like, what if you'd throw $95 million into Staples Mill Station?
There are plans. There's a study underway or being requested by the state to massively upgrade Staples Mill. I think, for our region, if you look at any region over 1 million, they usually have multiple stations. Alexandria, which is one of the top 50 stations in the nation by passenger volume, is closer to Union Station than Main Street is to Staples Mill.
You're talking to D.C.?
Up in Northern Virginia, yep, and D.C. And so, having these multiple stations serve regions is not uncommon.
Walk me through some of the peculiarities of this. I've been, I study what China did coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis. There's this infamous stat that I think Bill Gates shared that they had used more cement, I think, in the 4 or 5 years out of the great financial crisis than the United States did in the entire 20th century. And a big part of that was high-speed rail.
Yep.
And the Pudong bullet train. And they're very boastful when you go into Shanghai that these trains take, a little sliver of the time that their American counterparts do. Is it impossible, this dream of having true high-speed rail in the United States on the eastern seaboard? Maglev or Japanese style, European style?
I don't think so. My grandfather did transportation for the Department of Defense, and he told me once his job was to figure out how to move troops, tanks, and toilet paper from any point in the country, from point A to point B. And when I asked him, why Europe had high-speed rail and America didn't, his response was they had a small conflict in the 1940s that allowed them to rebuild their infrastructure. And so as Americans, we invested in highways, and we spent, I think, over in excess of $7 trillion since the 1950s on building roadways in America. Other countries decided to go with railways. And so they took rail lines like the DC to Richmond, and they took it from 40 miles to 50 and from 50 miles per hour up to 100 and from 100 to 200. And so there's a model out there of how to do it, of how to continually upgrade our rail lines. It just takes continued investment. Part of the problem is on Capitol Hill and DC in the federal government, they fund Amtrak 1 year at a time. And so if you were trying to run a business and you didn't know what your capital investments would be 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, it's very hard to make those large investments in infrastructure when you basically have it go with a cup in hand every year and ask for a couple dollars.
What are the peculiarities of this kind of Richmond to D.C. line? You wonder if we could pull it off, if it could truly be efficient, or even a Richmond and New York thing, the potential for this place to be kind of a bedroom community. I don't know if it's a good thing to kind of turn into a Fredericksburg or something. The real estate values, the livability, the people wanting to move here to be within true access to Northern Virginia, to make a morning commute of it.
Absolutely.
What would have to be done to pull that off? You use this metaphor when you're touring and lecturing. A Corvette stuck in traffic can't really be a Corvette.
It's all about adding infrastructure. The same trains that you get on here in Richmond and you go north of D.C., you travel in excess of 150 miles an hour. Not the whole time, but you do get up to those speeds.
What, for 10 seconds? Where?
For a couple minutes north of Baltimore. But it's like a Corvette in I-95 traffic. You have the ability to go real fast. You don't have the opportunity. And so when we talk high-speed rail or high-speed rail in Virginia, we're talking about building the infrastructure to allow our trains to reach their potential. And especially given the context of, the state released a report that said to build 50 miles of new I-95 between Fredericksburg and D.C. would cost $12.5 billion. And it would not change traffic at all. They would have to spend nearly $40 billion to make a dent in I-95 traffic. And I-95 would be 17 lanes across from one side to the other. And so when you're talking spending $40 billion to fix traffic for 10 years, I think we're running into the point of time when we need these alternative modes of transportation. Like, we have tried roads. They did well for 50 years, but now we're reaching our breaking point.
Do you have a number in your head what $40 billion would do in terms of track investment on this corridor? What would that buy you?
So if Virginia's state subsidy for Amtrak is about $16 million.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay.
And so if you were to spend $12.5 billion on building 2 new lanes, one north, one south, it would equate to about 750 years worth of Amtrak subsidies on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia, not even fixed traffic. And so in regards to, our operational costs here in the Commonwealth, it's very little. Like, we have a lot of infrastructure we could build and really make a big difference.
What about the VRE? Can you explain that to me? Or why don't we have commuter rail access between Central Virginia and the D.C. area that other places do?
Because it would be too slow. VRE is a commuter rail service. So it is meant to kind of serve a metropolitan region, very similar to the New York.
Is that decidedly Northern Virginia, not?
It is, because it takes longer to go on VRE from Fredericksburg into D.C. than it does taking Amtrak from Richmond to D.C.
Get out.
It does, because you have to do all these stops. It's a commuter rail, so it serves every other stop, whereas Amtrak can skip stops and hit just the major regions on the way up and in.
I tell you, I absolutely, especially if you think about the costs, like the airport here has had bad consolidation issues and you have fewer choice going to LaGuardia. It's pretty prohibitive if you have to, on 2 or 3 days' notice, fly to LaGuardia. And LaGuardia is not a pleasant airport. I don't know if you're young, but
I've been there once or twice.
I've been dealing for years. And, Newark is not exactly convenient and used to be JFK option. But if you want to go to New York, the thing that frustrates me the most, candidly, is that 1-hour stop in D.C. Why does that still happen well into the 21st century? Why do we need to do that?
It's because of the lack of federal investment in Amtrak.
No, but what are the mechanics behind that stop?
So they have to switch engines. They go from diesel outside of the Northeast Corridor to electric engines on our Amtrak trains north of D.C. And so it takes 45 minutes for them to switch one engine, take off the electric or diesel, and put on the other.
Why does Amtrak have to switch engines? Why can't they just make one train be continuous and a true Northeast Corridor line? We did have Richard Anderson on Here and Now telling Jeremy Hobson that, after all, he considers Richmond to be the southern terminus of the Northeast Corridor.
Absolutely. Because, first, it's because the other corridors are not electrified. And because we haven't invested in dual mode engines, which is something that Richard Anderson actually is a strong advocate of. And so instead of having 2 different engines that you have to switch off and spend 45 minutes or an hour, you would have one engine where you turn off the diesel engine. It's like a hybrid car.
My 2012 Camry is advanced.
And so you turn off the diesel, you turn on the electric, and then you go north without having to switch engines. And now you cut the time in Union Station down to 15 minutes or less.
So that entails actually parking there in the station where, you could go out, stretch your legs, have a smoke, go and have
they take the engine off and put a new one on.
Really?
Yeah.
And that throttles you by an hour and 10 minutes?
Yeah, it cuts it down, or it adds about an hour to the trip. Yep.
So when I step back from this, I've heard forever. You remember with the Obama first 100 days, shovel ready, and this, that, and Terry McAuliffe and high-speed rail. It's something that sells. It sounds great and whimsical, and we got to do that. And clearly, the absurdity of, you see hitting a part of the track with a sledgehammer and the Hudson tunnels and whatnot. We have 1910 caliber technology still surviving well into the 21st century. But in the end, it doesn't get anywhere near the funding it needs for infrastructure. It's a tough sell. And I wonder when we hit a tipping point, what I call is a fork in the rail, when people realize that you can't put 17 lanes on I-95. You can't make this situation any better by throwing more money at it. When do we get there?
I think we are getting there. Virginia's ridership on our trains is continuing to grow. We hit their highest ridership on Virginia's regionals last year, with 924,000 people taking them. The 2009, 2019 memes are very popular right now. And if you looked back at 2009, ridership on those same trains was less than 400,000. And so ridership has almost doubled, more than doubled on our regionals. Virginians want more rail service. Younger Virginians want more rail service. 22% of Virginia's millennials don't have a driver's license. So how are we attracting new businesses? How are we attracting companies and retaining employees when you have an entire generation that doesn't want to drive? And the cost of building highways just continues to skyrocket. So I think we're getting very close to that breaking point.
Danny, I remember I was in graduate school in Boston, and that was also a frustrating thing. You had two stations to choose from, but the problems were there clearly with, getting to New York, going down through Connecticut. The bottlenecks were enormous. But even the train service wasn't very satisfying, to the point that you could take from Back Bay luxury buses. I remember they're called limo liners that were able to avail themselves of the HOV lanes. They had Wi-Fi. They had amenities that you would not even get on the top flight Acela line, which is, great but flawed. Is bus a decent alternative here?
Not if you sit in traffic. It's not. If you have a bus that's going through heavily congested areas, then it's no different than driving. It does have a lot of environmental benefits. It does provide a lot more service to some communities, but I think we need to really kind of diversify our portfolio and get out from just an entire road diet and start investing in all the different modes. One of the things that the misconceptions is that, rail is the only money loser in transportation. I don't think there's a mode of transportation that makes a profit. Airlines require FAA and all these towers, and I think that cost is about $500 million a year, if not more. Roads require, I think, $20 billion in general fund transfers every year because the gas tax just isn't keeping up with requirements. And so every mode loses money, but it's the economic benefits that come after that fact. The person who is not sitting in traffic and is working on the train, making billable hours and growing the economy, those type of things are where we see the economic gains of rail.
What's the state of play now? I remember Ashland was up in arms about, higher speed rail and the track going through. Ashland is kind of a proudly railroad town north of Richmond, right?
It is.
That's where we take the Father's Day train from Main Street Station. But there's this idea now of not in my backyard.
There is, and we see that.
Wait, one other thing. In fact, because of the mediocrity of the Staples Mill Station, a lot of people say that one of the great life hacks is to go to Ashland, to go to Randolph-Macon College and take the train from there. You would think that they would want it. You would think that would bring economic activity and not, but if anything, it's brought congestion.
It doesn't, and Ashland is going to be, a long-term issue, I think, for the Commonwealth of Virginia. As we continue to expand tracks, there's going to be 4 tracks almost to Fredericksburg. And 3 tracks down to Ashland. It's going to move back into 2 tracks before going back out to 3 tracks. And so it is going to be a major congestion point in the decades to come. And so that's going to be an issue for that community to decide how they want to mitigate that situation.
What about with regime volatility in the governor's mansion in Virginia? You have a single term limit thing, and it could shift between someone who really wants to lavish money on high-speed rail and a person who wants to starve it.
Yeah.
That kind of volatility. I mean, now you have the Democrats getting the State House back, the delegates back. Yeah. Are the Senate back? Are they looking to?
I think there's going to be a huge transportation push in the next couple of General Assemblies, but thankfully, rail has always been a strongly bipartisan issue. Virginia is unique in that we have a dedicated funding source for intercity passenger rail, and that is primarily thanks to Governor Bob McDonnell and Senator John Watkins. We have seen rail expansions under Tim Kaine when he was governor, as well as Terry McAuliffe and Ralph Northam. And so no matter what side of the aisle a politician in Virginia sits, usually they are supportive of rail, and we are very thankful for that.
We know that CSX, which is now based in Jacksonville, Richmond is a CSX town. I mean, the old Chessie system and Seaboard, that the idea here has been that it has asserted itself much more than passenger rail. It's much more politically connected. Freight rail is a very profitable service. You see it like Warren Buffett bought a railroad because it's a way to play the booming, emerging markets that want commodities, that want grains, and it's very much short-shrifted passenger rail relatively. How much of that have you noticed in Virginia, the relative clout of an organization like yours, which is grassroots, versus very moneyed players saying that, this is a waste of time?
We as an organization co-signed the Supreme Court briefs in support of giving Amtrak and the Federal Railroad Administration the ability to set standards for on-time performance. So the host railroads certainly have that ability to delay our trains or put them on the sidings, and that causes decline in riderships if trains are never on time.
That's a real,
That's a
you
real
heard the
issue.
Devin Leonard interview. That's it seems to be illegal because in the statutes, in the formation of Amtrak and passenger rail and the split off from freight rail, they were told to behave in the early 70s. And
Absolutely.
50 years into it, it's kind of enforcement is optional.
Well, and part of it is there has never been any standards or any penalties. And so if you're being told, don't eat the cookie in the cookie jars, but no matter how many cookies you steal, there is no penalties or fines or pushback, then it doesn't matter. And part of the reasons why the railroads gave up their authority and why that mandate is in place is because most people don't know that the original alignments of CSX's and Norfolk Southern's multi-predecessor railroads, those alignments were given to them by the government. Governments built most of the rail lines in the country. And then, they turned them over as private companies to operate them in the 17 and 1800s. And those private companies merged and merged and merged. And then they became CSX and Norfolk Southern, BNSF, et cetera. But those original alignments go back to, Virginia buying the land from the landowners and allowing those rail lines to be built.
I'm not an attorney, nor do I play one on radio, but isn't there an eminent domain issue here? Like, can't they come in and say, look, we're doing this for the broader good? Again, these are private profits versus a broader public gain. You talk about, again, the quote-unquote benefit, the externalities. I get to bill more hours. I get to be on a laptop. I get to spend less time on 95 and stuck in the mixing bowl.
They can. I think, the government is always hesitant to use eminent domain nowadays for property rights, and they would rather just, purchase the right-of-ways when the opportunities arise. But there's a lot of rail corridors that used to be 3-4 tracks that had been torn up. So the right-of-way is there. It's just a matter of putting the infrastructure back. For most of D.C. to Richmond, outside of Ashland, the alignment is there to add 3 or 4 tracks. And so it's just, the going back in and building where there used to be.
What do you mean by the alignment, the topography?
Well, the right-of-way. So the right-of-way can hold 3 or 4 tracks. It's just they had been torn up over the years. And so now we have to go back and put them back in place.
You're telling me that between most of D.C. and Richmond, we can add, as is right now, 3 or 4 more tracks?
Yes. But, we still have to re-engineer. We have to fix a lot, a part of that over that right-of-way. They added roads or they added highways. And so we have to fix some of those issues, straighten a little bit of curves to allow the trains to go faster. But yes, for the most part, the right-of-way can sustain 3 or 4 tracks.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. We're talking to Danny Plaugher, Executive Director of Virginians for High-Speed Rail, an association of citizens and communities advocating for better passenger train service. Give me the most exciting stretches, the things that are going to rebuild. You talk in a lot of your analysis about routes that were abandoned or left to kind of wither on the vine. If you think, Hampton Roads, Roanoke, other places. What about east-west? Like one question I pose is, isn't Richmond a sister city with Charlottesville? And shouldn't there be like a quick express train availability that lets you avoid having to do the 64?
We believe so. Earlier this year, we released a report about the Commonwealth Corridor, which we say is connecting the beach and the Blue Ridge between Roanoke up through Lynchburg and Charlottesville, over to Richmond and down through Petersburg and Williamsburg and the Hampton Roads. And basically connecting the state on an east-west basis. All our trains go north-south today. And so we're at the beginning of the beginning. We have requested a study be introduced in the General Assembly, and so we'll be doing a feasibility study, or the state will be doing a feasibility study to figure out, what it's going to take to get new east-west train service up and running. But that's very exciting. It's been one of the most requested things from our members. The state is planning to add a lot more service. I think 81% more trains between Richmond and Hampton Roads, or D.C. down to Hampton Roads, as well as additional train service out to Roanoke and the New River Valley. And so there's a lot on the horizon for new train service and better train service.
Someone always whispered to me that there should be something connecting William and Mary to U of R to UVA. Is that even possible?
The Commonwealth Corridor will do that. It will connect. You have all these universities. So if you want to go from William and Mary and go see your friends in Blacksburg, you just jump on the train when that headquarters up
But
and
it's not
running.
a crazy thing of having to go to D.C. and then transfer to D.C. to go there, is it?
Today, if you want to go from Roanoke to Norfolk, it takes 16 hours with a 6-hour transfer in D.C. because you have to go up, transfer, and come back down. And so, our goal is to eventually have better than car competitive service east-west.
What is eventually?
Eventually is, whatever the feasibility study, when it comes back and says these projects need to be done, we have to put them through the 6-year plan. We have to approach federal money. And so hopefully sooner rather than later.
Do you see how people yawn through that, though? I mean, no offense, but you saw what Chris Christie did to the Hudson tunnels, right? When something is adopted by administrations, people who are not long for the State House or Congress or anything want results now. They want to bring home the bacon now.
Absolutely. And that's the problem with where we're running into in infrastructure is, sometimes these things take much longer than they should. The new Lynchburg train, I think, took 2 years from the time the study was released until the time the train launched. The DC to RVA study has taken 20 years because of the constant changes in administrations, both state and federal. And so I'm always hesitant to put a time frame, but we're at the beginning of the beginning. We're moving the needle, and we're trying to get this ball rolling.
Finally, in the few minutes we have left, are there any interesting hacks you can share with us? In the interest of service journalism, by the way, I really envy my friends at Capital One because they have this. I even want to get like a pass as a janitor or something at Capital One because you can go from their West Creek campus to Northern Virginia on this deluxe bus that gets to avail itself of the highest speed HOV lanes. It's apparently the best way to get between. And that's what a company like this needs to be convinced to spend a lot on this region. Its headquarters are in Northern Virginia and in McLean, and it has most of its employees, I believe, here. Are there other hacks within the rail system? Is there a train that you rely on? Do you go out of Ashland? Yeah. Do you drive to Fredericksburg, take the other leg? Do you take anything out of Main Street Station?
I do. I always try to take the regional trains because if you want a train that runs on time, you want a train that starts from your backyard. So I always try to take the trains that start from either Hampton Roads or Richmond because I know for the most part they're going to be running on time. And so I know I can get to my meetings when I'm supposed to. And then I try to buy a train ticket or two back, and then I'll return whatever one. It used to be much easier to return a train, if you bought 2 train tickets when you didn't know what your meetings were going to be, and then return one, but it's a little bit more difficult nowadays. Virginia has discounts to get 15% off train tickets. That's a program they launched. I encourage folks to take advantage of it if you're riding a Virginia regional train and enjoy the ride. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff coming down the tracks.
Enjoy what? I'm sorry.
Enjoy taking the train.
Enjoy the Wi-Fi that works 1 out of 5 times.
We're working on improving the Wi-Fi, but hey, at least you have Wi-Fi. If you were sitting in I-95 traffic, you couldn't be on your computer working.
I just wish there were a drone that could lift me above the parking lot morass at Staples Mill, and I can avoid the East Germany in 1972 experience and put me right on the train and. It's hard to pull off. Are we going to see there are rumors that Staples Mill Station is either going to be replaced or scrapped for something grander?
I think it's going to be improved. There are, the state has requested a grant to do a full overhaul of a multi-million-dollar study to upgrade it and give it modern amenities. And the state is really kind of pushing improving all our rail stations across the Commonwealth.
So you're trying to say by 2056 we might have improvements?
Hopefully well sooner rather than later. Well sooner than 2050.
Danny Plaugher, you are the man. I appreciate it. Danny Plaugher, Executive Director of Virginians for High-Speed Rail, an association of citizens and communities advocating for better passenger rail. What's the Twitter handle?
VHSR.
And how can people get involved on Facebook?
Go to VAHSR.com. Or just search us Virginians for High-Speed Rail on all social media.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Robin.
Full disclosure, our engineer is John Valentine. Listen to this show on NPR member station VPM News and on iTunes at link fulldradio.com. I also have to plug the NPR One app because I can't live without it. We are always on track, caboosting our signal. Come on, ride the train. It's a choo-choo. I'm Robin Farzad, back with you next week.